side of the courtroom. They're saying those facts alone establish need for federalization.
All right, come on in, folks.
Based on what Parrish just read to you, Mr. Leonard, what is your take on that? Do you believe that is enough to establish need for federalization, or does there need to be more?
I think there needs to be more. I mean, first, the judge will have to first address the issue. Was there even the authority to do this? Did it have to go through the governor? She may, that may end the issue right there, in her opinion. Number two, is an appropriate use of the forces, which I don't think it is under the law. It is something that by the law on its face and by precedent is invasion, rebellion, so things of that nature. And then the other issue is that even if they could be here, they can't engage in what are really law enforcement activities. So I think for all of those reasons, I think Perry is going to rule in favor of the plaintiffs. And the way it's moving, as you're describing it, maybe if Judge Perry only has an hour or two of questions, we will get that written opinion today or tonight. And, she could also rule from the bench, indicating that here's what she's doing. Written opinion will follow. So that definitely could still happen today.
Oh, that's interesting. So she could make an oral ruling from the bench with the written opinion to follow. And is there some kind of alternate ruling where she, I was kind of confused in terms of what the ruling was in Los Angeles, where she can grant the TRO, but then also say that they don't have to go home right away? I mean, what was that ruling in L.A.? Because it's unclear.
Yeah, I'm not too familiar with that one. I mean,
all right, so we got a lot of
what she
going
should
on.
Be doing is either granting preliminary injunctive relief, the TRO, or denying it. Okay, if she denies it, then the case can still proceed on its merits. There still is a lawsuit pending, but the extraordinary relief, meaning stop things in their tracks, maintain the status quo, that wouldn't be the issue. So I expect her either to grant it or deny it. I don't think there's going to be any in between here. And then the question is going to be, will either side have the ability to immediately appeal it on what's called an interlocutory basis or by way of mandamus or not? Will they have to wait until there's an actual full-blown hearing with witness testimony and evidence offered? Or whether, that none of that may happen. The parties are going to have to make strategic moves based on
National
what
Guard on ground.
Perry does today. But I would expect the Trump administration, if they get the TRO entered against them, that they're going to want to get in front of an appellate court by any means necessary and as fast as they can.
It was just brought up in the courtroom, the case of Martin versus Mott, in which the Supreme Court case concerning the President of the United States using emergency powers. Are you familiar with that particular case, Mr. Leonard? And I guess it begs the question here, in what they're trying to sort out, is did the President have the sole authority in this case to decide when to call up the National Guard?
Correct. Yeah, and I don't think this certainly fits the emergency that they're citing. But I don't think it still gets them around the law. And even if it gets the troops here, what they can be used for is very limited. So I still think that they're, based upon the law, the facts, the Constitution, the federal statutes at issue, I think that the defendants still have the losing hand here. So I would still expect, Judge Perry to rule in favor of the plaintiffs.
You hear all this kind of saber rattling about the Insurrection Act. If the president were to come out and just declare the Insurrection Act, what do you think would happen then?
Well, we'd be litigating that. So,
exactly.
Folks, we have a situation in Chicago.
This is far from an insurrection. And, insurrection is the level of someone moving against the government, someone taking action against the government as if to almost overthrow the system. So the fact that you have protests, they may be out of hand in some respects in some points in time. I mean, this is tame to a lot of the stuff we've seen historically here, even over the last, 5-10 years. So I think they're really reaching, but of course they're going to reach. They're going to make every argument they can to fit the president's actions within any statute, executive order, any precedents they can get their hands on. So it's not surprising the defense is raising, new and somewhat novel arguments. That's their job.
And the defense just said as well that it doesn't have to be actual rebellion to federalize. President should be able to prevent acting in danger of rebellion. Also citing 10th Amendment claim does not apply to valid federal action.
President should be able to prevent. I mean, whether they think they should or should not, there's a constitution. There's a federal apparatus of laws.
What do you make of that?
Well,
ahead.
I was just going to say, if regular forces aren't sufficient to enforce the law, Michael, can you just explain that little clause a little bit? Because that seems to be a bit of a gray area.
Yeah, that's something that really hasn't seemed to have been litigated at all. So you have the two prongs that really seem to limit it to, rebellion, insurrection. Then there's other clause that says that the National Guard troops could be called up if regular troops are not sufficient to enforce federal law. I mean, on the face, I read that as regular troops, meaning the regular armed services. So I don't know if that even applies either. But they're of course going to try to argue
National Guard is on the ground in
that they
Broadview.
can, or any constitutional argument that's different than the statute, because it gives them more breadth to argue if you can broadly argue generically under different constitutional provisions about the power of the president, the use of militia, the role of state sovereignty, and how the federal government usurps that in certain situations. So they're going to make all sorts of, hopefully well-founded attacks or good faith attacks based upon the Constitution. But ultimately, I think, again, the plaintiffs certainly seem to have the upper hand.
It's interesting that you say that because as just happened in court, the defense is arguing that the deployment is lawful. Like you said, they will try to argue their point. They're saying that it is lawful, it is within the authority, and it is responding to urgent, serious, and ongoing threat. But I guess us being here on the ground so far, kind of like what you said, Attorney Leonard, we haven't really seen that. We haven't seen that magnitude of threat. So that is something, right, Attorney Leonard, that they will have to prove in court. They will have to show examples.
Right. Well, and I think they already brought up the cars being rammed over the weekend. That might be one example. Although, when that phone call was made to call the police, the dispatch mentioned that these are 30 armed ICE agents here asking for some backup. So it's not as if they are protected there. And also, the president does have the ability, if he believes that they need backup, he can call other federal agents. He can call ATF. He can call FBI. He could call further immigration agents. Correct, Michael? I mean, there are other agents that are within the law, the president's purview to call up that aren't military.
Oh, absolutely. There's a whole horde of federal agencies, from the FBI to Homeland Security to ICE agents. I mean, there's a lot of people that can be called up before the National Guard. This is clearly a political move, a show of strength, kind of a test of the courts, and particularly when you're reaching into another state, the state of Texas, who you're strongly aligned with politically, to try to bring their troops here. That's a certain political statement that you're making by doing that. So clearly here you even got ISP, Illinois State Police, you got Cook County Sheriff. So it doesn't factually seem like a scenario that fits kind of the picture they're trying to build. And I think it's interesting if you look at Judge Perry's background and how she'll come to this case. Her background is in law enforcement, has been really exclusively as a prosecutor. So she understands police, she understands law enforcement, she understands all the various levels and layers of agency. So I think she's probably well situated to take on those arguments and really, have a really good understanding whether they make sense or not from the practicalities of on the ground. I think she's in a great position to not be hoodwinked or to understand, what they're saying.
Attorney Michael Leonard, federal criminal defense attorney, we really appreciate you staying with us. You stayed with us for quite some time, to give us some perspective, and we appreciate your time today.
Thanks, guys. Real appreciate it. I'll be looking forward to the opinion just like you, but your analysis seems to be right on. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much.
I do want to go back to the video that we had because we talked about the troops, the National Guard, being deployed there at Broadview, and we had past video of them being out there, but we just had the shot up out there in Broadview. You can see them on the rooftop. I don't know if we can go back to that before we go to our next interview, but it is, they're there. And so I'm sure this will come up in the courtroom to really establish why they're there. We haven't seen, at least not today, we aren't seeing a lot of violence or anything on the ground. That's the video right there of them on the rooftop. And when we went to Gabriela Primus, there were like 5 people out there.
Yeah.
So,
and that's been most of the time. I mean, most of the time it's a small group of protesters. And again, the times that it gets contentious is when you had people trying to block the driveway, but now they've cordoned that off, and they've successfully created zones where the ICE agents can carry out their business and protesters can express their First Amendment rights. So it seemed to mitigate the need for further enforcement. I want to go back though to the case the state was making, in that once they brought in the state police, there are emails the state is citing here where ICE officials are thanking the state police, saying, you've helped get everything under control. They're citing an email from over the weekend saying they were grateful for the help. There's conversations between ICE and state police exchanging kudos and managing the protests. So it does seem like the governor calling in the state police was a move that basically not only helped keep the peace, but bolstered the state's legal argument here in that the National Guard is not necessary. But, the weekend is when things have gotten contentious at
Very true.
at Broadview. But again, what is we need more clarity.
The threshold of what's considered to be, acts of violence and to go beyond really what we've seen so far. We aren't the deciders here, but to decide, at what point is it necessary to call the National Guard, I think is what everyone is questioning. The judge will have to ultimately decide on basically what she's hearing from both sides. We do want to go back to Gabriella Primus. Since she's out there, we're starting to see some National Guard activity there. Gabriella, can you tell us what you're seeing there on the ground?
Good morning, Paris and Tia. I'm keeping an eye out and I'm watching that fence behind us. We're at the Broadview ICE processing facility, and typically we see some movement of ICE agents behind that fence. Now today, just a few National Guard members. But I do want to take a closer look as we see the protesters. I am going to, we're seeing actually some National Guard members, it looks like, walking up to the fence. Hopefully we're getting a good look at that. We showed you a video earlier of some Texas National Guard members on top of the roof, and we do know now that they are from Texas. We saw that big T on their arm, so that helped us will decide that it's Texas versus Illinois, because we know that both are responding or deployed here to the Chicagoland area. We're not sure what's behind that fence that they're kind of leading into, but we know that, they've been walking around getting a lay of the facility. We saw some of them on the rooftop there, where we typically see ICE agents standing and watching some of the protesters, making sure that they also have the facility covered. But just some movement, I guess, in and out of that fenced area that's also blocked off, so we wouldn't be able to see inside even if we had a really good zoom on our camera. I do have to just be careful of some of the things that are on some of these signs. There is a small group of protesters here, but some of them do have curse words printed on them. I have the microphone close to my face here because we are hearing again some curse words as well. So again, small group. There's actually probably more press here.
Hey, Gabby, I hate to wrap you.
The National Guard going in and out, but I'll send it back to you.
All right, Gabby, thank you so much. We'll try to get back to you. We do have some people at the microphone right there in the Dirksen Federal Courthouse. We believe this is Lovey and Lovey. They actually filed the lawsuit. We want to listen in.
From the top.
North or south? I understand. It's hard to do. Do whatever you gotta do. It's gotta be north or south.
That's the North and South clause of the First Amendment.
All right, we'll start again. My name's John Lovey. I'm a lawyer with the firm of Lovey & Lovey, and together with a group of lawyers, Protect Democracy, the Civil Rights and Community Justice Clinic at the Blum Northwestern Law School, Craig Futterman's clinic at the University of Chicago, Police Accountability Clinic. Have I forgotten any of the organizations?
The ACLU.
The ACLU also joined.
And First Defense Legal Aid.
And First Defense Legal Aid. A group of lawyers have filed a lawsuit on behalf of community members, clergy, and the press, seeking an injunction against lawless actions by federal officials in connection with the protests at the Broadview facility. By way of background, President Trump recently declared essentially that he was going to declare war on our city and other cities like it. He sent federal agents to, in his view, try to clean up the violence and the siege that he claimed was happening. as all of us know who live in the city of Chicago, there is no war here. There was nobody to fight. So when the federal troops got here and they were looking for trouble, there was nobody to fight, they turned their attention to attacking peaceful protesters. The people we represent who filed this lawsuit were exercising cherished First Amendment rights. They were holding signs, protesting, exercising constitutional First Amendment rights to protest what the government was doing. They were doing it peacefully, and they were doing it in a way that did not merit any violence. And they were subjected to tear gas, they were subjected to physical violence, they were shot at, less than lethal weapons were used against them, all for doing nothing but protesting what ICE was doing and what the federal officials were doing in our city. Exercising peaceful protests, they were met with violence, with tear gas, and with weapons. And they courageously filed this lawsuit, and you'll meet and hear from some of them, asking a federal court to enjoin that lawless behavior on the behalf of the law enforcement federal officers. And today, the court boldly and courageously entered an injunction prohibiting the federal agents from using violence against peaceful protesters, prohibited the federal officials from using a whole category of near-lethal weapons against peaceful protesters, against unlawfully dispersing crowds that are doing nothing but exercising their First Amendment rights. And we as a country are fortunate to live here where people can protest, they can make their voices heard, and can do that free of retaliation and free of violence. Because what was happening was people were protesting peacefully, clergy members were, exercising their faith, and the press was doing nothing but doing their job and covering it. And because the federal officials didn't like what they were saying, they meted out violence and weapons and tear gas. They were literally targeting people because of what they were saying. People were saying, some people were peacefully saying, we don't want ICE taking our neighbors. We have a right to speak out and say we don't support this. And in our country, everybody's got a right to say what they want to say. But instead of allowing those people to peacefully protest, the federal officials used violence, used weapons, used tear gas directly to silence them. And you can't do that. And today, a federal court enjoined it, and the federal court made clear that you can't do that. The federal officials have to tolerate people exercising their peaceful right to protest and their message, whether they agree with it or disagree with it. And you're going to hear next from members of the clergy and protesters and also the press, because that is a very important part of the plaintiffs' coalition here. Reporters and TV reporters and photographers are out there making a record of what's going on so that people can't distort what's going on. It's a brave job, and members of the press are doing it at risk that they're going to be met by the law enforcement officers with violence, and that's what happened. Some of the press were targeted specifically wearing press passes, clearly marked as press, and you got federal officials shooting non-lethal bullets at them, tear gassing them, trying to disperse the press. And in this country, the press play a very important role. I know they've been called the enemy and all that, but they fight through it, and they are doing their job.
So we want to chime in here and kind of bring down some of what they're saying to explain it. We want to be able to talk over this so we can explain what's going on here. This has nothing to do with what is going on inside of the courtroom right now at Dirksen.
Well, there are many things going on inside the courtroom. So this is a different lawsuit, and this is one that was brought by some press associations, journalists, nonprofits, and unions. Lovey and Lovey there, the defense attorney, basically talking about this suit that they protesters and journalists were met with extreme brutality. They claim that their First Amendment rights were infringed upon because they're saying, you cannot fire at people while they're expressing their First Amendment right. That is an infringement of the First Amendment. And one of the instances was the journalist at CBS 2 who was driving by, and there were no protests, but then an ICE agent had allegedly shot chemical munitions into her car. And I spoke with her for a good long period of time. She was telling me that she had just was driving by, observing, doing her job. There were no protests. There was no kind of safety threat. But she just felt she was targeted because that munition came right into her car, made her sick. She was throwing up for a while. She felt like her face was burning, and she felt like that was a clear violation of her ability to do her job, protected under the First Amendment.
Right, and just driving by. And also, another journalist had a situation, too. We're talking about independent journalist Stephen Held. He says he was tackled and handcuffed and detained while filming ICE agents arresting a protester. So we've had stories like that. And so that is why this lawsuit has been brought forth. I do want to kind of touch back on what's unfolding in the courtroom while this is happening downstairs.
Yeah, this is happening fast. And you've got the judge now asking some questions of the defense, kind of trying to get a sense of, well, what is it that they're here to do? Are they going to stay in Broadview?
Yes.
Are they going to come to neighborhoods? Can they engage in crowd control? Can they carry weapons? And the defendant saying, I don't know, I don't have additional info beyond what we've cited in the record. That's not a good sign for the defense there. If they're saying, I don't know, to these questions, that they don't have answers to these specific questions, perhaps the Trump administration not fully prepared for the arguments that they have to defend in court.
And also giving them a timeline as well. That has happened in court. The judge talking about troops at the federal courthouse tomorrow says no factual basis for that declaration, giving the defense until 3 o'clock this afternoon to prove why that's even needed.
Yeah.
So this is going to be very interesting. The judge is asking a lot of questions about why the troops are here. Also asking this question. They could be at neighborhoods and hospitals and schools, right? So it's very interesting. The judge is really questioning why the National Guard was brought here, and also citing some of what unfolded in LA as well. So it doesn't sound like you said, the defense was prepared.
What it seems like right now is exposing the fact that the defense is making these broad-based claims about lawlessness and crime, but then when the judge starts to dig into specifics, there aren't a whole lot of legal arguments that they're making, or a lot of answers that they have, and so we're already on questions. The judge said she was going to have a lot of questions, and like you said, she's going to give until 3 o'clock for the defense to prove why would troops be needed at the federal courthouse.
And so,
if you go to the federal courthouse, there's giant fencing that the federal government has erected there. Which is unusual. That's usually not. We've seen many high-profile cases there, and we have not seen the need for these fences to be put up. But they are there right now, perhaps in case there are protesters that target federal judges.
What do you make of that 3 p.m. Timeline there? Do you think that after 3 p.m. we could possibly have a decision on this hearing coming from Judge Perry? Because I find it very interesting that she's saying, prove it.
Yeah.
And after that, it sounds like that's it.
And she's given due diligence, and she's given, she could have ruled in Monday, right away on a TRO like the judge in Oregon did, but she didn't. She said, let's have time to make all of our arguments here, to answer questions, and that's what they're doing. So she's giving them a lot of due diligence here to kind of drill down into, because this is a serious situation. Now she's asking, will they be solving crime in Chicago? And the defendant now saying, well, to an extent, protection, that could lead to a reduction in violence. So conflating what the president has said, well, we need to go bring the National Guard in to solve crime, versus to just protect ICE agents and doing their job. Those are two different things.
Two different things, and two different things that have now been brought into the spotlight, because initially when this conversation of the National Guard came into play of being deployed here in our state, specifically in the Chicagoland area, the argument from the Trump administration was crime. And we know that you can't put all your eggs into that basket, because when you look at crime, we talked about this yesterday, you and I, crime is overall down over
Right.
30%. So that argument doesn't really
It doesn't,
stand.
and also the governor has to call the National Guard to respond to if it's a public safety issue. But if the president is going to declare an emergency, the data that shows, and no one is saying that Chicago doesn't have a violent crime problem, but if the data shows that your murder rate is on track to be the lowest it's been in 30 years or something like that,
yes,
then that pours cold water on the theory that there's an emergency here that needs to be taken into effect. Well, then why wasn't there an emergency 5 years ago when we were up near 900 homicides during COVID, or in the 90s, you know, where consistently the city was up around 900 homicides. You know, it's hovered around between 400 and 500, 600 over the last several years. But that's, again, another theoretical argument. That the other thing is the National Guard, military, they're not law enforcement troops.
Right,
that's not what they do. So you can't make the argument that they're here to bring down the crime rate or to stop crime, because they're not public safety enforcers. They're here for backup. They're here for help.
And crime is not, and the judge is asking about specifically crime, and they're talking through this right now inside the courtroom. The judge saying president states they're coming to solve Chicago's crime, stop rapes and thefts. That's not a federal crime, right? So why would you, essentially she's asking, why would you then want to put the National Guard here? We are looking at the Broadview ICE facility. At one point when we were looking at this, we saw just a handful of protesters, but we are seeing those protesters start to gather in numbers, a few numbers.
Friday's been typically the day where protesters really gathered, although you've got the mayor of Broadview, Katrina Thompson, who issued the hours that they can protest, the curfew. You know, at 6 p.m. they have to be out of there, you know, for the protection of the town. And I know a lot of protesters were upset about that, but, you know, Mayor Thompson bringing up the point that we've got neighbors here that need to live their lives, need to go to work, need to take their kids to school, pick them up from school, and cook dinner, and not have the threat of tear gas coming into their windows, which has happened. So so that's, you know, another kind of layer here that has protected some of the operations out there in Broadview, allowed them to be more orderly. So the judge, more statements were coming in from from Anita Blanton, who's in the courtroom, and, you know, basically the judge is saying there's a large discrepancy in what you sent me and what the president has stated elsewhere. So saying that the president is making these public claims, but then when it comes to things being sent into the legal record, there's a vast discrepancy here. And we've seen this pattern with the president. He'll make claims on social media and in the media, but then when they have to go to court and the rubber meets the road and they have to satisfy legal statutes, things are very different.
Hold up. It doesn't
whole
hold
different.
up.
Yeah, it doesn't hold up.
I want to go back to something that you said, and we'll go back because we're still getting, you know, text messages coming in from Anita Blanton inside the courtroom. But I want to go back to something that you said about the layout of Broadview, because I do think it's relevant. And for those who are watching who have never been out there, this is right in the middle of a neighborhood. Right? There are homes. There are people that, you know, can sit on their porches and watch all of this. We are getting some new information coming in here.
Yeah, no, this is in the middle, 25th. There's a big, busy thoroughfare that was closed off for a little while, right off the Eisenhower. There's the border of Maywood right there, a couple blocks of Maywood, and then Broadview. All residential, largely African-American community, largely middle class. If you go down Roosevelt Road there's lots of small businesses. And lots of neighborhoods and folks that just want to their chance to live with all this madness. You know, when you get further away from the ICE facility, you see, you know, you're not really caught up in that. But then the issue is the helicopters that are constantly overhead. So it's all those considerations that Mayor Thompson has brought into play in terms of deciding on a curfew.
Yeah, I'm looking at, we just got some more text messages from inside the courtroom. The judge is saying this, so I should only look at one set of the president's statements and not others. Troubled by, at the moment, this is the judge, that when I try to nail down with you what's on the table, you have very few answers. So the defense having all of these arguments, at least we've heard from, you know, the Trump administration of why the National Guard should come, but inside the courtroom, no full-scale plan or details of why they should.
Yeah, it doesn't look like the Trump administration has a very detailed or strong defense right now. They're talking in vagaries, and then the judge is drilling down and basically saying, I'm troubled here, that when I try to nail down what the specifics are, you don't have any answers, like in terms of where are they going to go? Are they going to go into the neighborhoods? Are they going to arrest people? Are they going to do public safety? You're not answering the question. They're not prepared here for those specific answers.
And also asking the question of why are they here? Like, what are you really bringing them here for? And so far, just looking at what has transpired in court, no real answers on that.
All right, so now we have the defendant saying, well, we hope this is the beginning of turning the corner, but we can't make representations about what the future holds and what may be needed. So again, not telling you what they're going to do is a pretty it's pretty tough to be successful to win a legal argument if you're going to not even tell the judge what you plan to do with the troops here, and they're saying, well, we don't know what the future holds. So the judge is responding, your picture of what may be needed does not reflect that of Broadview Police and the Illinois State Police.
Very vague statements from the defense. No concrete numbers, no concrete evidence to really prove their point of why the National Guard should be here.
It underscores that maybe the Trump administration has not issued a specific plan to National Guard officials saying, this is your plan, this is what you're going to do, and it underscores the PR component to a lot of what the president does. The National Guard, I'm sending in the troops, that sends a strong PR message. It rallies the base. People get excited. They retweet stuff.
Right.
But then you've got the operational part of it. Well, what are they going to do? What's the plan? What's the operational plan? From the defense arguments here, they don't have that. They don't have a specific plan. It's almost like ready, fire, aim. Let's get them in position, and then we'll determine what the plan is.
And I know, we have gone out into the communities. We've gone in the city of Chicago specifically. I, in fact, did a report on the west side and also the south side of the city, just asking residents, what do you feel about, the National Guard possibly coming here? A very small part of our population here, so it wasn't a complete sample. But I know you were talking about data, and when I went out there on the ground, boots on the ground, I heard from a lot of people that said they did not want the National Guard here, but there are some people that do, and perhaps they don't understand the legalities of behind when the National Guard is deployed and why, and really what they would be doing. They cannot be law enforcement in your neighborhood. There are still shootings in Chicago. You and I understand that. We get it. We're born and raised right here in Chicagoland, but that is not enough for the National Guard to be deployed in your neighborhood. And in fact, they wouldn't be able to stop anything.
Yeah, and there is data. There were polls that sampled a cross-section of Chicago, and about 70% saying no to the National Guard, although the number was a little higher in some of the Black and Latino communities, because those are the communities that face some of the problems, but still not even reaching 50%. And what those communities did vote in favor of, or the data showed that they are in favor of more police.
Right.
And police know the communities. Police are trained in policing, obviously, but also familiarity with those communities. And that's one thing National Guard is not. If you're bringing them from Texas, they're not familiar with Englewood or South Shore or Austin or the West Loop or Lincoln Park, wherever they're going to go. And that could be dangerous to the troops. That could be putting National Guard in harm's way here without any familiarity. But what the residents will say is it reflects the understanding that it is police that is here to police and solve crime and to, help enforce public safety regulations. It's not federal troops.
And we have heard from residents that have said, some of them understand, okay? They're not ignorant to the fact that the National Guard can't police and really do police work on the ground. But some people in the neighborhoods that I've talked to, I am born and raised right here in Chicago, grew up in some of these really tough neighborhoods, still have roots in those neighborhoods. People feel like the National Guard potentially standing in their community may be enough to stop criminals from acting. But in fact, what we have heard, at least today, from what we have heard from the Trump administration's plan, they're not in the neighborhoods. They're at Broadview. Tomorrow they were slated to go possibly to the courthouse, if that's even going to happen. That's not in the neighborhoods where, in fact, you would want crime to go down for those that are saying, come here. So, even though it would be, not the action of the governor anyway.
And that is the one case that folks have made. We talked to Gary McCarthy, the former superintendent. The one case you could make for National Guard in terms of impacting public safety is if their presence, their mere presence
Right.
on Michigan Avenue or whatever, it deters smash and grab or burglaries or things like that, and then it helps police officers redeploy to other areas. But then the question is that what you want your city to look like? Do you want federal troops in camouflage standing in these, you know, tourist areas and these nice areas? Mostly Americans don't want that. That's why we have very strict federal laws on what military officials can do. So you know, the trade-off is maybe it does deter some of these crimes downtown, but at what cost? At what cost? We're looking like we're in a military zone or in a war zone.
And very true, because I know we're talking about the smash and grabs, which, you know, I'm not here to say they aren't a problem. They are definitely a problem in the city of Chicago, but also, is this live right now? Are we seeing a live? Okay,
I think
so
this
that
is
was video.
yeah.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure we're looking at some file video here of things that have unfolded over the last few days. But going back to the point of smash and grabs, they are definitely a problem here in the city of Chicago. But people that live in the neighborhoods feel like their crime, you know, crimes that are happening in their neighborhood is a problem too. So if the National Guard isn't there, does it change anything?
No, but the thing is, like, you think that they can't really be armed, they can't really police, and so if they're going to a neighborhood like that and they're just going to stand there, A, they're going to be in danger if they don't know this neighborhood. B, you know, there's a lot to say that it can provoke more unrest. It can provoke more anger. Let's say, what's to stop? Let's say purported gang members from looking at them and then, you know, saying, you know what, we're not going to just sit here and allow that to happen. You just don't know.
And
you know, it's provocative, and that's why Mayor Johnson and the current thinking is that trust, community trust, is an essential part of policing. So you have to have folks in the community know the police officers, trust the police officers, or else it creates a more tense situation, and it's not safe for anybody.
Yeah, and you bring up a good point about community policing. You know, that is what the mayor and also the Chicago police superintendent has pointed to for this reduction in crime. That's what they point to right away, to say, you know, a lot of these nonprofit groups that we see working in the communities have brought down crime. So,
and they say, you know, if the president wants to help, there are, and there's that tweet that or the truth that we saw, you know, saying that the mayor and the governor should be in jail from the president. But the local officials keep saying there are ways you can help. You have frozen federal funding for some of these programs that help public safety, or you could send us more funding for more police officers, or you could send more federal ATF or FBI, which it does seem like the FBI director was talking about doing. But when you talk about the National Guard, what the governor has said, what local officials said, is that is a provocation. That is a show of force. That is an attack on the community. That is not, you know, a public safety measure, because these kinds of things just provoke more unrest, more lawlessness, more, you know, anger in communities. And I do believe we have, do we have Carolyn Shapiro on the line? We have.
let's go to her.
Let's go. Carolyn Shapiro, former Solicitor General in Illinois, and obviously professor at Kent. So Carolyn would be bringing lots of cases, I think, before judges on behalf of the state of Illinois. But Carolyn, I don't know if you've been following some of the blow-by-blow here. You know, we've read off, the judge has a lot of questions. The judge has said she's concerned that there aren't many specifics from the defendants. What do you make of all that?
Well, I've been listening to what the two of you have been talking about, and I agree with your assessment that the government's inability to answer the judge's question is a real problem for the government. The statute that they're relying on allows the president to federalize the National Guard only in certain relatively specific circumstances. One of them is if the federal government is unable to, I'm going to read this, unable with the regular forces to execute the laws of the United States. And so that's part of what she's asking about. She's saying, well, how is it that you're unable to execute the laws of the United States? And how are you going to deploy these guardsmen in service of that particular that particular prong? And they really don't have answers beyond saying, well, the sort of vague sense of protecting certain federal facilities. And I'd like to add that with respect to protecting the federal courthouse, where this hearing is actually taking place, the chief judge of the Northern District of Illinois said that she does not think that the National Guard is appropriate, that there is a building security committee, that they rely on the U.S. Marshals, they rely on the courthouse protection services, and that they haven't requested the National Guard and don't think they need the National Guard to protect the federal courthouse. The other argument that I haven't seen really fleshed out yet in the reporting I'm seeing from the hearing is that the federal government is arguing that the fact that there is a threat of rebellion in Chicago, and just the threat of rebellion in Chicago is sufficient to call out the National Guard, to federalize the National Guard. And that's a really remarkable argument here, because what the federal government is arguing is the fact that there are protesters and people who disagree with what the government is doing is itself somehow a threat of rebellion. There has been some criminal activity in mostly property crimes that the government has alleged, but nothing that comes anywhere close to a rebellion. And the notion that disagreement and peaceful protest creates a threat of rebellion is really would have the founding fathers spinning in their graves.
Carolyn, we're getting some updates from inside the courtroom, and I want to get your reaction to what we are just getting a text message from our reporter about. The judge said you reference more guns in Chicago than L.A. Just so we're clear, there is a right to bear arms. Defendants, this is what the defense is saying. People are wearing masks, preparing to go in and harm agents. Evidence of ICE indiscriminately gassing peaceful protesters. I'd wear a mask too.
Wow.
It goes on to say, the judge says, are you aware a TRO has been issued against ICE for excessive force, Broadview, and more generally? The defense says, I'm not aware.
Yeah, so that's the case we just heard
Yes.
from Lovie and Lovie, the other case, the First Amendment case. And so the defendant's saying, I'm not aware. Judge obviously aware.
Is aware of it. What do you make of that? It sounds like the defense, a lot of things that the judge is bringing up, the defense does not have concrete answers for. How do you think this plays out in the court for them?
Well, I think the judge is obviously very concerned about the facts on the ground and is trying to make sure that she's actually going to be ruling on the basis of what's actually happening. The fact that the defendants can't support their position with facts and are actually unaware of what's happening in another courtroom in the same building I think it's not good for them. I think this judge is being extremely careful. She is not ruling on the basis of simple allegations. She's really trying to drill down both into the justifications for what the president is doing or trying to do, and also what the plans are, and then compare that to those justifications. And the government doesn't seem like the government is doing a very good job of being able to respond to those really quite appropriate questions.
And on that front, Carolyn Shapiro from Kent, IIT Kent, thank you so much for your...
Both were able to present their cases, both sides, and now she is asking questions specifically. What can you tell us about how this all happens and maybe why she is handling it this way?
Sure. Thank you for having me. Pleasure to be with you. So what the judge is doing is testing both sides' theories, in particular the Trump administration's theory on why it needs to deploy the National Guard to Chicago in the interest of aiding ICE agents in enforcement of immigration law. And Chicago and the state of Illinois' arguments counter to that we don't really need National Guard here to help enforce federal law, that there isn't the kind of lawlessness that the Trump administration has said surrounds ICE enforcement in Chicago, and that the National Guard really aren't needed here. And so the judge is looking at both sides of the arguments and looking quite carefully and cautiously at both sides of the arguments.
Through what's going on in the courtroom right now, we are getting some more correspondence that the judge is presenting some questions to the defense. And I want to get your reaction to this, Mr. Schwinn. So the judge has said, assuming every person who assaulted and vandalized federal authorities and properties, committed an offense, and they were arrested and prosecuted. You believe the president is unable to execute laws of U.S. Your understanding of execute is preventing, okay? The defense then says, we're not saying commission of one crime is evidence. This is repeat and harming DHS and property and overall mission. And the judge responds in this way: riddle me this. Drugs have been dealt in Chicago for many decades. So that means the president has had the authority for decades to send in the Guard to assist DEA. What do you make of that exchange?
Well, I think it reveals that the judge is highly, highly skeptical of the Trump administration's theory here. What the judge is saying is, look, we've had crime in the city of Chicago, as there's been, in every community nationwide. Crime itself doesn't mean that the president needs to bring in the National Guard to enforce federal law. That just doesn't make any sense. There's nothing particular about this time on this day in this so-called emergency that requires the deployment of the National Guard any more than, an ordinary street crime 2 years ago or last week would have required the deployment of the National Guard. I think this reflects a high degree of skepticism on the part of the judge to the Trump administration's theory of the case.
And we're just seeing from the judge, a big issue for the defense today is not really being able to define what the National Guard is here to do. And the judge says, I expected you'd tell me they were here for immigration laws. Sounds like your argument could mean anything. So it sounds like the defense really has not come with an argument that was specific or tailored to what exactly they were going to do. I'm curious, Stephen, she's going to issue her ruling, which it's leaning towards she's not buying the Trump administration's argument. But in the ruling, do you anticipate, language that might resonate, that might, be kind of, because judges in these rulings, sometimes they say things like the Oregon judge said the facts, the Trump administration, something to the effect of they're not comporting with reality. So would you anticipate like a strongly worded ruling here that kind of sends a message?
It could be a strongly worded ruling, and certainly the judge seems to be leaning in that direction. I mean, the problem here is that the Trump administration has characterized the on-the-ground situation in Chicago in a way that is just not supported by what appear to be what is actually happening on the ground. And moreover, as you suggested, I think quite rightly, the Trump administration hasn't settled on a firm legal theory here. So on the one hand, it's saying that protesters are impeding federal immigration law enforcement. On the other hand, it's saying that protesters are creating a kind of rebellion. And yet, on another hand, we're hearing from the White House, although we haven't heard this in the court pleadings, but we're hearing from the White House that the president has inherent plenary authority to deploy military forces in the National Guard to a city like Chicago. That's an extraordinary claim. And I think what the judge is pushing back against is the idea that these claims, if they were to wash, if they were to stick, that would mean that the president could deploy the military and the National Guard anytime, anywhere.
Yeah, interview that was on another network where it was said that Donald Trump has plenary authority has now gone viral with people saying, wait a minute, what exactly does this mean? I want to ask you this. It appears, obviously, we have to wait for the judge's ruling. But from everything we're hearing from that's coming out of the courtroom, as you have yourself stated, and it sounds like maybe that they are having a hard time trying to prove this, what happens if the judge does in fact say you cannot have the National Guard deployed in Chicago? You cannot have them where they are. You need to send them back. And then the Trump administration says, we're going to keep them here anyway, and we're going to go to a higher court.
So at that point, it's important to remember that everything that's happening right now is preliminary in the sense that this isn't a full-blown trial on the underlying merits. What Illinois and the city of Chicago are asking is for a temporary restraining order on the part of the court to prevent the deployment of the National Guard under Trump's orders. If the court were to issue a temporary restraining order, I would expect that the Trump administration would immediately appeal to the Seventh Circuit on an emergency basis and ask the court to what we call stay the lower court's injunction, basically put the lower court's injunction on hold for the time being. And if the Seventh Circuit were to reject that, then the Trump administration, I would expect, would go to the Supreme Court on the so-called emergency docket, or sometimes called shadow docket, and request the same kind of relief. But again, it's important to remember that in some sense, this is all preliminary, that we're not really dealing with the underlying merits. What we're dealing with is a likelihood of success on the underlying merits, that the underlying case will continue to move forward. Now, if the judge declines to issue a temporary restraining order, or if a restraining order is stayed by the Seventh Circuit or the Supreme Court, what would that practically mean? It would practically mean that the Trump administration could deploy the National Guard to Chicago.
Well, Paris, you were just looking up some, comments from the president that were made already this morning.
Right.
And it sounds like his plan is to keep the National Guard right here.
Yeah, he basically said, like it or not, if the governor likes it or not, we're going to keep the National Guard. We're going in. But again, they can't. I mean, if Judge Perry rules on the TRO, then they can't. But I want to also bring up a statement from the chief judge, basically to these rumors that National Guard is going to go protect the federal courthouse. The Chief Judge, Virginia Kendall, says, providing access to justice is at the heart of the court's mission and critical for our democracy. Maintaining access to the courthouse for anyone who seeks redress remains a top priority. It's a core principle to the rule of law. She goes on to say she is in charge of security. She has requested additional steps from U.S. Marshals to maintain security there. She has not requested the National Guard for the courthouse. And if the president sends the National Guard to guard the courthouse, that would be over the objections of the chief judge, Virginia Kendall there, who says it is her jurisdiction to decide that. So this is many layers here, in terms, and this plays into this hearing because Judge Perry is saying, well, I thought you were going to tell me they're here to just guard immigration, but it looks like you're not really defining what they're here for, and it could be anything.
And now the conversation about sanctuary cities is now
is
playing out in court now, too. So the judge has asked the question about sanctuary cities and saying, does that mean conditions are met in every sanctuary city or state for, obviously, the National Guard being deployed? And the defense says, different situation, we're citing violence. And the judge says they're not. So it seems like, again, the judge is not on the side of the Trump administration on this. Paris mentioned, that the president has said that, the National Guard would stay. They would go to the courthouse is what we're hearing. What happens in that case? From your perspective, Stephen, is this then a battle of the courts to figure this out? Will it all play out in court from this point on, no matter, because it sounds like no matter what happens with this TRO, the Trump administration, specifically President Trump, wants the troops to be here?
It's a tough question. We've never really faced this kind of situation before, and so we don't really know how this would all play out. Ordinarily, an administration would comply with a lower court order pending appeal, and if they wanted to go ahead and appeal, they could appeal it, but they would comply with any court orders. If the Trump administration is declining to comply with a court order, it's difficult to know exactly what the enforcement mechanism would be then against the administration's deployment of the National Guard, again, against a court order. It also makes it really difficult to understand exactly what the administration's theory is here in deployment. It's looking more and more like the administration is taking a vast, expansive view of the idea of a rebellion or its inability to enforce federal law as a justification for deploying the National Guard in a broad, sweeping kind of way. I mean, for example, if the president were to deploy the National Guard to protect the federal courts, right? That's a pretty broad, sweeping theory of protecting against rebellion or enforcing federal law. And then just one final beat on this. If the administration's theory, as it may be suggesting outside of court, but nevertheless suggesting that the president somehow has plenary authority to deploy the military and National Guard, well, then the theory would say that even the courts can't restrain the president in doing that. That's a breathtaking theory. And again, we've never seen anything like that. And it's just not clear to me how it would play out.
And let's bring up more comments from the judge here, Stephen. The judge is saying we'd be in a different position if your argument had been we're having problems on federal property enforcing immigration laws. You have not narrowed that scope. I'm struggling to find out where this would ever stop. Help me understand if what you're proposing is really as broad as what it seems. So again, drilling down into this notion that the federal government has not really been specific. They've been very vague on what the purpose of the National Guard is, and the judge expressing some skepticism that, well, if it's just immigration enforcement, that is not what you're arguing today. What's your reaction to that exchange? The fact that the defendants still have not narrowed their scope of what the National Guard is here to do.
That's exactly right. And the judge is picking up on this and expressing frustration with the administration's lack of a kind of determinate focus on what the National Guard would do here and the theory for deploying the National Guard in Chicago. And I think what the judge is identifying is just a very vague theory of deployment. The administration hasn't really defined precisely why it's deploying the National Guard, and that might be because it just doesn't really have a great theory for deploying the National Guard. And so it's using a kind of scattershot, spaghetti on the wall approach to say, well, you know, we need the National Guard to help with law enforcement kind of generally. We don't need to specify what that means, just kind of trust us, or that we need the National Guard to put down a rebellion of some sort that the administration has imagined. And, you know, Judge, you should just basically trust us on that. And so the administration's theory here seems to be wide sweeping, kind of very ill-defined, and relying on a sort of trust us sort of claim.
Well, Stephen, before we let you go, with what we're hearing coming out of the courtroom, with what we've told you, it's sounding like maybe the governor is going to at least possibly get that temporary restraining order. Where do you see this going in the future? You know, right now, as I said earlier, there's also a court hearing going on in Oregon, and there's other states that will probably be having to deal with this as well. As you look at where we are now, what do you see coming up in the future with all of this?
It's a good question. And I think given that this is going on in Oregon right now, too, and there's a hearing going on right now at the Ninth Circuit about the Oregon case, similar kinds of questions are coming up, although maybe not exactly the same level of skepticism on the part of the Ninth Circuit judges that we're seeing here in Chicago. If the court issues a temporary restraining order, I do expect that the Trump administration would immediately appeal that on an emergency basis to the Seventh Circuit and then to the Supreme Court and seek a stay of that order. At that point, it's a little difficult to know exactly what would happen. The Trump administration has seen sort of amazing success at the Supreme Court on the shadow docket, on its emergency docket, and these emergency claims to stay lower court orders, halting the administration's lawlessness. It may be counting on the Supreme Court issuing a stay in this case as well. And I think the theory for that would be that the courts really ought to be deferential to the government in determining when the government is unable to enforce the law or when there's a kind of rebellion that the government needs to deploy the National Guard for, a kind of deference argument, a sort of trust us argument, as opposed to digging into the details and looking closely at the merits. And the Supreme Court, quite candidly, the Supreme Court has granted the Trump administration victory on top of victory on its shadow docket on a similar kind of theory, a basically sort of trust us kind of theory. And so it's hard to say exactly what the Supreme Court would do with this case, but if history is any guide, the wind is certainly behind the Trump administration on this at the Supreme Court.
Stephen, it's still going on. The court hearing is still continuing. I want to ask you about this specifically. The judge has said that there's actual evidence that shows ICE started tear gassing, sounds like protesters, and then they put on the masks first. We keep hearing from the defense inside the courtroom. They're talking about things that could happen in the future rebellions, future things happening at the courthouse. Is that enough to bring up in court to have this go their way, to talk about the future, not something that's taking place right now?
It's a great question, and that's really so much of the back and forth here. So the Trump administration is saying that there's lawlessness and rioting, what the government is saying, the Illinois government and the city of Chicago is saying, well, that's caused by the aggressive enforcement by ICE and the fact of deployment of the National Guard. In other words, the Trump administration is inspiring the very kind of lawlessness that it says that it's fighting against. And it's that back and forth that the courts are going to have to sort out. Everything that we've heard from the judge in today's hearing suggests that she's highly skeptical of the Trump administration's claims. I don't know that we'll see that same sort of skepticism if and when the Trump administration appeals a temporary restraining order in the higher courts. We'll just have to kind of wait and see how that plays out. But a large part of this is this sort of deference that the courts will traditionally give the government in a situation like this, that the deference the courts would give to the Trump administration in determining when they need to deploy the National Guard under federal law. This judge looks like it's not willing to give the judge or give the administration a ton of deference, but the higher courts might.
Stephen Schwinn, Professor, we appreciate you joining us and breaking this down and your thoughtful approach to what's going on. Thanks for joining us. There's still a lot to be had. We're waiting to see what's going to happen next. We have somebody in the courtroom. And also, we're going to be talking about the ramifications of the National Guard in Chicago. With so much going on, it's impacting some events that were supposed to come and some events that are happening.
Match.
Yep, soccer is just one. And we'll be talking about that when we come back. So please stay tuned to follow.
That's crazy, folks. So let me show you something here too. I'm going to take you outside the ICE facility in Portland. At the same time what's going on in Chicago, the Ninth Circuit in California is also ruling on this. So, we kind of got a glimpse of, what is being said in this courtroom. The way the media is putting it out there is as if, the judge is not buying the Trump administration's argument and justification of having National Guard troops on the street. So as Magnolia put, it looked like the judge is taking this situation under advisement by hearing both sides. Usually these hearings last an hour or so. But this is going to be very interesting for sure. And I'm seeing if they're going to try to make a comment on something. Again, this is based off what the media is putting out there. This could be a whole other, once we get this ruling, it could go in favor of the Trump administration. We just don't know. But what we do know is 100% fact that National Guard troops are deployed and they are in Chicago Broadview. They were at the Broadview ICE facility today. They were there. They were there. So that will be interesting. There's an actual media outlet that's outside the ICE facility in Portland. I wanted to show you a glimpse of what it looks like there. We're going to put this up here because it's all the same. It's all the same. And as you heard with these press conferences with, in Chicago, they're in direct coordination with the Portland officials, Pritzker, with the governor of Oregon, and Brandon Johnson with the mayor of Portland. They're all doing these type of lawsuits and restraining orders similar to each other and kind of paralleling each other on, not allowing ICE to do this. National Guard. National Guard is the issue. National Guard is the issue. ICE is going to do do their thing. It's about the National Guard being deployed. But this is a look. There's a media outlet that has been doing some feed that's saying continuous 24 hours outside the ICE facility. They started early in the morning or during the overnight hours when it was pitch black out there. There's people out there. But this is not the same as it was that we've been seeing for days last week. But I want to learn more about Chicago because Chicago piques my interest for sure. People are starting to say things on Twitter. I want to try to get a response here about the federal judge in Judge Perry in Chicago. See what the judge says. We're getting a sense on how the two Trump nominees on the 3-judge panel considering the National Guard deployment in Portland might see the case with raised voices. They have repeatedly pushed back on the argument by Oregon's lawyer, Stacey Chafin, that they need to focus on whether the current situation justifies sending in the troops, and that they can't take into account events in June when a protest forced an ICE facility in Portland to temporarily shut down. So, yeah, you know, it's going to be interesting. But keep in mind, folks, that the Ninth Circuit has already ruled on this matter when it comes to California with the National Guard troops, you know, going into Los Angeles. I mean, the Trump administration is putting evidence of, you know, ICE and DHS agents under attack and using that, and ultimately the judge allowed it in California. All right, so CBS News, Chicago has just put out an article, 500 National Guard troops deployed in Chicago area amid legal battle. And they're saying that they have been deployed. It says approximately 500 National Guard troops from Texas and Illinois have been deployed in the Chicago area and mobilized to protect federal agents and facilities amid a legal battle over their deployment. According to the U.S. Northern Command and at the Department of Defense, approximately 200 soldiers from the Texas National Guard and 300 soldiers from the Illinois National Guard have been deployed in the greater area of Chicago. Their mobilization will last for a period of 60 days. So it goes on to say these forces will protect ICE and other U.S. government personnel who are performing federal functions, including the enforcement of federal law and to protect federal property. The troops have been stationed at the U.S. Army Reserve Center in southwest suburb of Elmwood, where new fencing has been installed since the Texas Guard members first arrived on Tuesday. Crews have also installed privacy screens along the interior of the existing fence line, similar to what they were doing down there in Texas when the last administration with the Texas National Guard going there to kick Border Patrol out of Shelby Park in Eagle Pass with the fencing and whatnot. So several trailers have been set up at the facility as temporary living quarters. Several soldiers were seen moving in with bags of belongings on Tuesday, some holding rifles and carrying folding chairs, possibly for meetings or other trainings. Northern Command said as part of their duties to protect federal agents and facilities, the troops would be assigned to establish security perimeters, perform crowd control, and use de-escalation tactics. While soldiers would be allowed to temporarily detain people to prevent an assault or interference with federal agents, Northern Command said they will not be arresting protesters. There was a handful of demonstrations outside the facility on Wednesday, a couple to protest against the arrival of the Texas Guard members and a couple to support them. So there's been some supporters and protests. And we're talking about Chicago. It has now been confirmed that 500 troops are on the ground in the Chicago area. 500 troops. 200 from Texas, 300 from the Illinois National Guard. Goes on to say, let's try to find out what additional information. It goes on to talks about Judge Perry's court hearing that was scheduled for 12 p.m. We were listening to that, or we were listening to, some details of what came out of there. That ultimately the judge is going to take under advisement whether the Trump administration has the legal authority to deploy the troops. We'll see what happens there with that aspect. So U.S. Senator Dick Durbin from Illinois said the president invoking the Insurrection Act to justify troop deployment would be terrible. And there's some speculation if the judge rules against the Trump administration, Trump could invoke the Insurrection Act. Possibly. So, yeah, that's going to be interesting too. They streamed the Portland one. I mean, we could watch it. It's kind of lengthy though. Let me just see a little bit more of what's going on in Chicago. We're kind of going back and forth between Chicago and Portland here, with the situation with the National Guard. Ultimately, the decision by these judges are going to be, issued really soon. And then it's, if one party doesn't like it, obviously they're going to go through the appellate process. You're going to go through the appellate process. Let me just see more about Chicago. But look at the ICE building. I mean, it's literally boarded up. There's not many people out there today. 500 troops are on the ground. All right, Border Patrol Commander, they're playing clips of Border Patrol Commander Greg Bavino announces 100 National Guard troops have just arrived to Broadview, and has a message for Governor Pritzker. We have a governor and a mayor, and they want crime to happen in the city. They are advocates of criminal, illegal aliens harming American citizens. These same politicians are increasing violence against law enforcement, riots, and lawlessness. That's why you now have the National Guard, to take care of business. So that's coming from Greg Bavino, who has just confirmed to Fox News that 100 of those 500 troops are now at Broadview. So it's happening in real time. It's happening in real time. Let me get some more information here. I'll possibly get that clip up here. Bavino says that 100 of those troops, of the 500, 100, because the CBS Chicago is saying 500, 200 from Texas, 300 from the Illinois National Guard are deployed in the Chicago area right now. And as you heard what we were hearing at the court hearing, it appears one of the roles is to protect the federal building in downtown Chicago. Now, why? Why would they want to go to the federal building? Why would they want to go to the federal building and protect the federal building instead of being out on the streets? Well, I have some speculation here. I have some speculation why they would protect the federal building. I possibly think that people are going to be federally charged, and they don't want people. Now, people could go as far as high as Pritzker and Brandon Johnson. I think it's inevitable. I think the indictment of Pritzker and Brandon Johnson is coming, personally. I mean, when you have a sitting president that's openly saying that they should be in jail, it makes me think like they're going to get indicted for something. I don't know what. Maybe it's some investigations about Brandon Johnson in his gift room. Remember the gift room? Remember the gift room with all the lavish gifts? Something to do with that, or maybe something about Pritzker and Johnson involved with contracts, no big contracts, this migrant during the migrant crisis, some sort of financial stuff, or possibly them, allowing the ICE agents to get attacked. I do think Brandon Johnson and Pritzker is going to be indicted at one point. Maybe that's why the National Guard troops want to go to the federal building, to protect the federal building. So when they go to court or others get arrested, so the protesters or rioters don't storm the federal building, because that's what we heard there during that court hearing, that one of the jobs is for the National Guard to protect the federal courthouse. Why the federal courthouse? What beef would people have with the federal courthouse in Chicago for the National Guard to have to be there to protect it? It's not like people just want to go to a federal courthouse and attack it, right? Well, they were doing it in Portland years ago. But somebody said in the chat, doesn't the federal government always protect the federal building or the federal courthouse? It's true. I mean, they would, right? That's their goal, is to protect federal property. How much federal property is there in Chicago? You have the federal courthouse, AUSA's office, FBI buildings, military bases. What other federal entities are there in Chicago? And protect the federal building might be ICE would go out there and do all their thing, and people might want to just take it out on the federal building and just deface, attack it, spray graffiti, harass people there. I don't know. Take it out on federal officials there. Doesn't appear that they have arrest powers either. But if the Insurrection Act gets invoked, then it's a whole other ballgame. A whole entire other ballgame here. But National Guard troops are, it's confirmed, they're all on the ground in Chicago. We are looking at Portland right now. So the FBI director put out some statistic numbers about Chicago and said, FBI Director Kash Patel stated on October 7th during an interview with Fox News that Chicago has 110,000 active gang members in the city, about 5% of its 2.5 million residents. That's a staggering number. 110,000 active gang members, which is 5% of the 2.5 million residents in Chicago, based on intelligence from a recent visit. This figure echoes a 2020 Chicago Police Department estimate of around 117,000 gang members across 55 gangs in Chicago and numerous factions. Whew. So many gangs. Over 90% of the Chicago gang members are Black or Latino. So 110,000 gang members, that takes up 5% of the population. Yeah, you got a problem. That's a lot of people. Can't get 110,000 people in any sports stadium. That's a lot of people. That's a lot of gang members. A lot of gang members. We got a clip of Bovino. I just want to share Bovino here. We'll put up Bovino.
Glad that the National Guard's there at that Broadview ICE facility. There's actually a lot more than 20 there. We've got 100 deployed to that facility. Oh. As you know, that facility's seen a lot of riots, a lot of violence against ICE and Border Patrol agents. We're going to put an end to that violence that you've seen at that facility. We're really glad those National Guard members are there. They're going to do a fantastic job.
All right. Well, thank you for clarifying the number of troops that are there. The number I'd gotten earlier from DHS was 20, so it looks like they've increased, which is great. Chicago and the state of Illinois are going to court to block the Guard's deployment. If you could be a voice, Chief, in that courtroom today, what would you say?
If I was in that courtroom, I would say that we have a governor and a mayor that want crime to happen in the city, that are advocates of criminal illegal aliens walking the streets of the city in broad daylight, harming American citizens, and that those same politicians are increasing violence against law enforcement, increasing riots, and increasing lawlessness. Because of that, we have to do something, and that's why you have ICE, Border Patrol, and now the National Guard to take care of business. President Trump's taking care of business because the Governor Pritzker and Mayor Johnson don't seem to want to.
Right. So, Christy.
Whoa. See what I mean? So he has confirmed Greg Bovino, Border Patrol commander. You know him. You've seen his face all over the place. There was actually a hit out on his life. Some leader of the Latin Kings tried to put a $10,000 hit out on his head and others. He's confirming that there is 100 National Guard troops at ICE Broadview. CBS Chicago saying 500 National Guard troops are in the Chicago area right now. Deployed. They're deployed. They're already there. And they're at Elmwood and other places. So of 100 of them. So where's the 400 other ones? Probably waiting for orders. If the judge rules in favor of the Trump administration, which the judge said it's going to take this hearing today under advisement and rules in favor of the Trump administration, we could see National Guard troops in the Chicago tonight. Like literally Humvees and, their vehicles going around. Where would they go? Would they just, we saw them in D.C. and it was really up by, when we saw them in D.C., they're only like perched at different locations. They had checkpoints in D.C., certain crime-ridden area where there was a lot of carjackings and whatnot. They had checkpoints to stop the carjackings, and then they had it up there by the train station in D.C. They had some Humvees out there and positioned themselves. They were cleaning up the area up there. So, I think this could be the same thing, just their presence, National Guard presence at certain strategic spots, like the courthouse outside Broadview. Now, we saw a glimpse last night of some protesters out on the street. It wasn't big, but it was kind of big. It was about 1,000 people took the streets last night. It seems like a lot of them came from Broadview, which the mayor implemented a curfew at ICE Broadview. There's a curfew there. And they can do a curfew here. They can do a curfew here. This is Portland. We're live. Look, this is live outside Portland. We're live outside Portland. But ICE Broadview saying the mayor, because the mayor said the mayor has heard from her constituents, and people were concerned about the craziness that was happening outside Broadview. So what did the mayor do? Implemented a curfew from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. Now, at the ICE Broadview, what we were seeing before the fencing and before the barriers and everything up there, these people would go Friday morning, tomorrow morning, particularly Friday mornings. They'd go be out there at 6 o'clock, standing in front of the streets, blocking ICE from coming in and out of the ICE facility there, about from 6 to 9. I think it was from 7 to 9 or something, 7 to 9. So interesting that the mayor said the curfews can't go there before 9 a.m. What happens if you go there? Some people say that might be a First Amendment violation. ACLU said they are monitoring the situation. I expect some lawsuits by the ACLU. I have another clip here. Things quiet so far after National Guard troops arrive in the West
National Guard
suburban
troops
Broadview.
arrived in Broadview.
They'll be on patrol in the Chicago area. Eric Rung is live in Broadview with more on this. Eric?
Well, good morning. Things have been relatively quiet out here all morning long. The National Guard arrived overnight, and according to the Village of Broadview, they released a statement a short time ago. They say that 3 vans with approximately 45 Texas National Guard soldiers arrived at the ICE facility. Now, part of the National Guard's mission is to protect federal agents as well as federal property. National Guard members had little to protect this morning in Broadview. The media more of a presence than protesters. The ones who are here are dedicated to the cause. People like Ryan Cuellar, even if they aren't sure what impact their presence will ultimately have.
My singularity in being here is not going to make a difference, but I know when this will be written about in history books, because it will be. And when it is, I want to know what side of the fence I was on.
A far different set of circumstances have played out in front of the Immigration Processing Center over the past several weeks. While there have been intense clashes with federal agents that included pepper balls and tear gas, protests for the most part have been peaceful.
Hey, go home! ICE has got to go!
The mayor here, citing public safety concerns, mandated protesters must stay behind barricades, and demonstrations would only be allowed between 9 in the morning until 6 in the evening.
I say this with a heavy heart, and I mean that truly. I don't know how much longer we're going to be able to be out here, regardless if it's our right or if it's our freedom. I'm not sure how much longer that's going to stand, and as an American citizen, that breaks my heart to say.
The Guard rolled in overnight from an Army Reserve base in Elwood, just south of Joliet, where they had been met with a few protesters and a handful of supporters.
I hope it works, and I hope that we do make our roads and villages safer for everyone so that we don't have to worry about the violence.
According to the U.S. Northern Command, about 200 soldiers are here from the Texas National Guard, and another 300 Illinois Guard members have been federalized and mobilized for a 60-day mission, a mission many elected leaders in Illinois at all levels of government strongly object to.
If you want to bring peace to the city of Chicago and the state of Illinois, this is not the way to do it.
The relative quiet that we are seeing today could change very quickly tomorrow. Fridays are usually the day that we see the largest demonstrations out here. You're live in Broadview. I'm Eric Rung, WG.
There you go. So they're there. Confirmation, they're there. Now, what's going to happen here with the judge? Federal judge. And if the judge rules against the Trump administration, will they just send out the national troops onto the streets anyway? Who's to say they wouldn't? I don't know. CBS News has something here. Hold on. CBS News is reporting in reference to Chicago. We're live out here in Portland because we're also monitoring this. This is live outside Portland. The chief judge of the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of Illinois says National Guard troops are not needed at the Dirksen Federal Building in downtown Chicago. The Trump administration has deployed hundreds of troops from the Texas National Guard and called up hundreds more from the Illinois National Guard to protect ICE agents and facilities, as well as federal properties. In Chicago, claiming the city is out of control and dangerous. Illinois and Chicago have sued over the federalized of the troops. And a hearing happened today. Federalizing the Guard only allows the Trump administration to send them to federal facilities and with federal agents. They are prohibited from being deployed to domestic locations for purposes of law enforcement, unless the Insurrection Act happens. Ahead of the hearing, Judge Virginia Kendall released a statement asking for troops to be kept away from the Dirksen Federal Building, one of downtown Chicago's federal properties that houses the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of Illinois. Providing access to justice is at the heart of the court's mission and crucial for our democracy. Maintaining access to the courthouse for anyone who seeks to redress remains a top priority of the court. Judge Kendall noted the U.S. Marshal Service has jurisdiction over security both inside and outside the courthouse, not the Federal Protective Service. She wrote that she trusts and relies upon the men and women of the United States Marshal Service and the court security officers to provide security at the Dirksen Courthouse. At no point did I, nor did the Building Security Committee, authorize or request the National Guard's assistance to secure the Dirksen Courthouse, the judge wrote. With my approval, additional security measures have been implemented to allow court operations to proceed, but those measures do not include the National Guard. Kendall said the court will remain open for hearings, trials, and ceremonies during their normal business hours. So, Chief Federal Judge has said that the National Guard is not needed at Dirksen Federal Courthouse in Chicago. So we got that aspect. Let me see what else we got here. Hold on, stand by. We got more information. The DOJ attorney today, the DOJ, Department of Justice attorney, says no actual rebellion is needed for president to federalize National Guard in Chicago. The Justice Department attorney, Eric Hamilton, said there doesn't need to be an actual rebellion for President Donald Trump to federalize the National Guard, and their deployment is lawful. The plaintiff's argument that the move targets sanctuary cities' laws is wrong. The argument also makes no sense when considering the federalized of the National Guardsmen in California. Adding that the force has since been responsibly drawn down. Because remember, they originally brought them into Los Angeles, and then they kind of calmed the situation down, and there's National Guard troops pretty much all left. Court doesn't need to decide what a rebellion is, the DOJ attorney tells the judge. The court doesn't need to decide if there's a rebellion, but rather just a danger of a rebellion. Oh, that's an interesting argument. So the court doesn't have to decide what a rebellion is, just the danger of a rebellion. It's interesting. Perry, the judge, April Perry, did respond to the DOJ attorneys thing. I think I do. Perry has repeatedly appeared very skeptical of many of the arguments presented by Hamilton and the DOJ. Judge also asks the DOJ attorney today in Chicago what the National Guard's role will be. Judge April Perry asked a Department of Justice attorney if the location of members of the National Guard in Chicago would be limited in certain areas, including neighborhoods and schools. DOJ attorney Eric Hamilton said that could be possible, neighborhoods and schools when protecting federal agents or property. So, interesting. The judge then asked the DOJ attorney, will they be solving crime in Chicago? Hamilton responded, certainly to an extent. The mission, again, is the federal protective one. So, DOJ attorney said, hey, if federal agents are near schools or neighborhoods, yeah, the National Guard could go there too to protect federal agents in these neighborhoods, because you know the ICE raids happening in neighborhoods. We've seen them. So the National Guard could be going around with ICE. And then if, you know, people, Brandon Johnson's goons or people, protesters, rioters, obstruction. I'm losing my tongue today. Obstructionists try to stop ICE from doing their duties. National Guard be there to protect them. Protect ICE. That's their role. Let me just do another look here. We're just live outside the courthouse. Nothing exciting outside Portland. You know, a lot of times in the day, nothing really goes on except when it's the weekend, nighttime, outside the federal facility. It's interesting out there. Pretty crazy out there. We covered it a few times out there at night, or as it starts getting dark, the black bloc of Antifa and these crazy radicals, these crazy people come out of the woodwork and stand out there. Let me just see what else, but that might be it for this particular segment, where we got our eyes on Chicago. Once the judge comes up with a ruling, or if the troops hit the streets, we'll share for sure. Popcorn ready, folks. I'm going to blow myself up here. Popcorn ready. So should you be. Crazy. Yes. All right. So, folks, with that being said, what's this? Pritzker takes questions. I'm going to wait for Pritzker's press conference. Johnson, they haven't spoken yet. But if they come out and speak, or we see the troops in the streets of Chicago or Portland or Memphis, don't forget Memphis. Memphis is not being talked about enough. They're going to be in the streets, Memphis, very, very soon. But no one's stopping them. No one's trying to stop them in Memphis. There's no lawsuits or restraining orders that I've seen stopping National Guard for being in Memphis. But once they hit the streets, we'll come back on live. Until next time, folks. JLR Investigates. Yeah, that's it for now. We'll talk soon. Be safe out there. Sub up, like, hit the notification button. Thank you, everyone that contribute. See a lot of the familiar faces. We got our eyes on Chicago. Have a good day, everyone.